Hi, this is Jasper from Amsterdam Vintage Watches, and I'm back with another story. Gather round, kids, as we dive deep into how I got two of the most beloved Submariners some 7 odd years ago. So firstly, I very much like this format, and apparently you do too. The last video about how I recounted the events that happened in the course of finding my Grail watch, the 6541 Milgauss. The video only had positive comments, so thank you very much for your feedback, and the support was greatly appreciated. So I'm back with another story, and I'm going to treat you with this perhaps emotional involvement of myself into these watches, and that showcase that timepieces are way more than just a utility, or on the other hand a investment for some people, or a status symbol. It's the true emotion that very much comes forward in this story. Again, started 7 years ago, 2017, when I got a call from the Rolex AD, where I used to do my internship over. And they called that they had a gentleman in, and this sir, around the age of, I would assume approximately 65 years or so, brought in a couple of Rolex Submariners, vintage ones, for service. Unfortunately, the service bill was so high that he was not willing to pay for it. It included the changing of the bezel, changing of the hands, changing of the dial, changing of the bracelets. So basically making an entirely new watch out of a 1960 Submariner, and on the other hand a 1980 Submariner. And my former colleague over at the Rolex AD called me if I was perhaps interested in buying any of these two watches. But they were severely damaged, as of course therefore the value of the restoration was so high. I was very curious, so I asked him to send the gentleman over, and I welcomed him together with his wife and his son. And out came again the plastic bag filled with watch pieces that I had to piece together. Always exciting when a client comes in and he reaches into his inner pocket to offer you some watches, because you never know what you're gonna get. And I was hardly stunned by the watches themselves. Of course, I had a 5513 myself many times over. Even in 2017, I handled multiple dozens. Same goes to say for the other one, the one from the 80s, being the 16800. However, I was very interested to learn how these watches came to look like they did at this very point. And the gentleman started by telling the story of why he received them, because he got them from his employer, and how they were used actually as a utility. So these days we're selling Submariner watches to people without a swimming diploma or anything, right? People used to actually use this stuff instead of just desk diving, as they call it. This gentleman started being fond of water at the very tender age of 3 or 4. He already started to swimming in the ponds locally, Dutch guy. And he turned that into his profession. And later on I came to learn that he kept everything surrounding his passion, his hobby, being diving, and his profession, being diving also. He kept everything around it, even his first swimming degrees, because he turned out to be very, very talented. He became the best of his class. He even received a book from Jacques Picard that, of course, within the people of the Rolex world is a very well-known name. And he went on to do military service as a diver in Aruba, where he didn't have these watches yet. But some odd years later, he turned it to the private field and went diving for mobile oil in Libya, in Tripoli to be precise. And there he received the first Rolex Submariner, being the 5513, that he really had to use. He explained back in the days, you don't have all these fancy equipment that you have these days. He really relied on the timepiece. For example, the bezel, of course, to measure the decompression stops. It was very important. And he also elaborated on the fact that back in the days, in 1960, it wasn't very uncommon. It wasn't unusual that they were working there with 70 or 80 people. It wasn't unusual that, of course, very sad, that people didn't come back up because they got stuck or they made mistakes, there were errors there, and people lost their lives. So sometimes his life even kind of depended on the watch. And he explained he was diving with, for example, Comex divers, also known as froggies because they're like frogmen. But he wasn't too fond of these French divers. He said he could do it himself way better. And he also turned out to be like the captain of his crew. So people kind of looked up to this fella. And you can also see it in all the provenance that's being kept. Again, he was a very avid collector of everything surrounding his diving career and his history. So you can see all these letters praising him for his work. And what he was doing was the underwater welding. So he had to weld these oil pipes, which is a very dangerous profession. And it turned out to be to his detriment because he was, as he was in my shop, explaining that he was unfortunately losing his sight. As you can understand, these jobs come with some difficulties. So he was becoming blind, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't feel it was appropriate to spend all his hard-earned money to revise these watches whilst he's not being able to see them a couple of years later, which was a very sad part of the story. But the positive part of the story is that he always used to rely on these watches, and you can truly see that in the aesthetics of the watch. At a certain point, there is this thing called, I wrote it down, 1 second, impact wrench that destroyed his 5513. It even fell off his wrist because of the drilling. And he actually conceived it, he got it back up, but the watch wasn't working anymore. And that's when he and his entire team opted for new ones. The 5513 had the plexi crystal, and by this time they already introduced the sapphire crystal in the 16800, and he switched over to using the 16800 underwater. And he has done that with great pleasure, he told me. And I was very curious to learn more, and obviously, so I told him I was willing to buy these watches, even though perhaps they wouldn't meet to the regular condition standards. If you just look at the watch, I was very happy that the watch was kept all original bezel, original dial, original hands. The dial, especially on the 16800, had some water damage, but it wasn't aesthetically unpleasing, let's say. It was kind of cool, and it showed how the watches were used. And I might even prefer a watch looking like this, especially being a Submariner, over a new old stock one, because you can truly feel, you know, people say if watches could tell stories, right? And if this watch could have told stories, it would have been crazy. But luckily, the guy wearing the watch told all these stories. So I told him I'm happy to buy the watches, to his surprise, because he thought they were useless. He thought it wasn't worth spending the 3,000 or 4,000 euro servicing the watch. But I told him, listen, I'll give you a very fair price back in the days, especially given the condition. If we are able to jot up the story, your experience, because I was just so eager to learn how he did all this, because he spent 50 hours a week underwater. He told me he spent so many hours a week underwater that he sometimes forgot he was underwater, like he had an itch on his head, tried to scratch and forgot he got a helmet on. So I decided to make the deal with him. He was absolutely overjoyed by the amount he got, but I gave it on one condition, that I was able to see all the provenance, that I was allowed to make this entire story that later on got published in the Esquire with the pictures alongside the article. Since I visited him in his house, he welcomed us, his family welcomed us. His son is a diver too, by the way, also went to Tripoli to dive, and he still loved that part of his life, which was a very important part of the life, and by extension these Rolex Submariners were important to him. And I told him I was going to revise the watches to make them as perfect as possible, to give them the honor, to restore them that they deserve after all these years of loyal service. And when I finished servicing these watches, he invited us to join him in his house for a lunch. We made some great pictures of a beautiful, beautiful afternoon where we spoke about the stories these watches have been through. He obviously showed me many interesting parts about his profession, his passion, and I shared mine, and it came together so beautifully. And that's how I experience these watches when I see them. And he was so thankful that I was firstly able to provide him with this amount of money that he wasn't expecting, but secondly, even more so because he could see the respect that was put into these items. Even though they're just items, people say it's superficial to love Rolex watches or whatever, but if you understand this story, you will understand it is not. And if you see the look in this gentleman's face, you can understand it is not. And he was so touched by that fact that he actually gave me his Ciba Gorham helmet, which is like the Rolex for underwater. But his entire outfit was weighing 18 kilograms back in the days. Going underwater, of course, there it's different because the pressure is different. But you have to understand, it's quite a cool accessory, and it was very dear to him, and he gave that to me. So that was very special to me. And of course, it was a prized possession that was displayed in our shop for many years until we moved over here into the lounge. We basically left everything in the shop, of course, except the helmet. The helmet is still here, and I was luckily able to welcome his wife at a later stage, and we reminisce about her husband and this beautiful story. And the helmet is still here. It still reminds me of these beautiful two watches. So that was how we were able to revive an old watch and give it new life. So should you have any of these watches laying at home, make sure not to throw them away if you don't think it's worth restoring, and make sure you don't restore them in the extent that you're gonna swap all the original parts out for service parts. Just hit us up. We're happy to make a new video in a year or two when we have your prized possession in our shop.